Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here and for organizing another hyperscanning event. I'm always very excited for sessions and even for workshops that are dedicated to the topic. I will speak about between brain coupling or neural synchrony from a biomarker perspective, from a clinical perspective, following our work using hyperscanning in personality disorders. I don't think I have to give any introduction into what hyperscanning is and why we need it and what it's good for. I think you already got a wonderful introduction by all the previous talks today. What is shared between all two-person neuroscience approaches is that you somehow try to relate the brain activity that you acquired using fMRI or EEG or NIRS, relate that to the brain activity of an interaction partner. And there are different ways to compute that. And I think what's shared between all of the results that we know so far in the literature is that neurocoupling relates to the quality and also the quantity of information that is transmitted between interaction partners. And that includes also the effect. Also, neurocoupling nicely predicts complex behavior that follows the interaction. So, for example, pro-social behavior, we also saw examples where it predicted the election of leadership in groups. It can also serve as an intention to trust signal, how willing I am to trust my partner in following interactions. And so, given that neurocoupling is so nicely related to relevant aspects of the interaction, I, as a clinician, thought, is it also related to the difficulties that our patients have in engaging with other people? Because social interaction is sometimes a core part of mental health disorders, but also sometimes our only source of information that we use for diagnostics. The data I will show was acquired at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Germany using fMRI. There are two fMRI labs that are linked and nicely synchronized with each other, and they're on the same premises, so subjects can meet and interact with each other, perform offline tasks, or just randomly get to know each other, and then each one is scanned in one of our labs. And we have almost no temporal delay in our transmission of video or audio data, trigger data, or whatever you like to send back and forth between participants. Okay, so today we're going to look at hyperscanning derived markers or their value for clinical research. The idea in biomarker research is that you take the data from a number of individuals, and this can be the population, this can be all individuals with mental health difficulties, or it can be individual with social interaction disorders. And from this data, you want to find characteristics that allow you to form meaningful subgroups. And this is not the same as trying to reenact the DSM category. So we're not trying to find all individuals with depression and all individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. But I follow a approach, which means I look for social interaction phenotypes that go across diagnostic categories. So examples of that would be that we look for individuals who have theory of mind difficulties, for example, or difficulties in the development and the maintaining of relationships, or we're looking for all individuals have a biased perception of the trustworthiness of their partner, and so on. And the idea of these social interaction groups or disorder groups is that we then use them to inform either the diagnostic process or the therapy. So this could mean that we can select elements of a standardized treatment and select those elements that the patient would most benefit from, or that is matched to their individual difficulties, or even match the best therapist given a particular problem. And you can do that using a variety of data. You can use behavioral data, questionnaire data. Leo showed these amazing interview videos where they quantify different things. And today we're going to look at between brain synchrony or neural coupling, and see how that can help us with finding such meaningful subgroups. So there are a number of criteria that a marker has to fulfill in order to be useful as a biomarker. One is, of course, it has to relate to the social interaction. And I think given the literature and also the talks that you've heard today, we can be quite confident and quite optimistic that this is the case. Also, in a clinical context, we need a biomarker to show us these individuals who have a particular difficulty. So either by a group comparison, comparing patients with unaffected individuals, or by a cross-validation approach for others. It would be very nice if our marker reflected changes in difficulty. So for example, if a patient benefited from therapy or somehow overcame their social interaction difficulties, then it would be nice if our marker would show these changes as well. And finally, we want to relate it to other real-world measures that I know are important for social interaction function or capability. And also, of course, the symptom load in general in our patient groups. We will look at these questions from the perspective of one social interaction disorder, a very prominent one, which is borderline personality disorder. Borderline has social interaction difficulties as the core of their symptoms. So subjects encounter repeated interpersonal conflict. It's a constant up and down in relationships. Those are very unstable. We have a lot of black and white thinking and fear of abandonment, and a lot of and very intense affective states relating to those interpersonal interpersonal problems. So it's a very burdensome disorder, and at the same time, a disorder that you will find quite often in a clinical context, especially if you look at inpatient treatment. So we invited patients to complete a hyperscanning protocol, and those were assigned to a random healthy control partner. And we have different subgroups of patients that complete our studies. One is the classical group of individuals who are currently affected by the disorder, matched with a healthy control subject. We have a very precious sample of individuals who had previously in former studies been diagnosed with the disorder and are now considered to be remitted, so they recovered from borderline. This is very special. I will come back to that later. And then we had patients who were interacting with patients and control subjects interacting with control subjects. None of these individuals knew each other, and also they were not informed about the clinical state of their partner, so whether there was a patient or not, or remitted or current patient. Most of the data, not all of the data, I will show you is from a cooperation task, a mutual gaze task, where subjects use their eye gaze to transfer information to their task partner. It's a very simple task where both subjects have to press a target button, and the information on which button that is given to one individual only. So they have to lock their eye gaze to the partner and then move the eye gaze to indicate which button there is to press. And this is a simple form of interaction, but one that we use constantly in everyday communication. Also, children use it even before they acquire language. So it's a nice and basic task, but it's useful from a clinical perspective. One, because it maps the development of our social interactions, or a theory of mind yeah, our theory of mind development, and also there are some clinical in these tasks. And from the modeling perspective, the task is also very useful because you have many ways of modeling within subject or within diet dynamics. You can compare them between diets and also, of course, between groups. How you compute brain synchrony, neurocoupling, and all these things is a topic that is very dear to my heart. I constantly develop the methods that I use further, and I'm now use dynamic causal modeling, which gives us a directed causal way of which brain affects which brain region affects what other brain region, and in our case, which brain affects the other in what way. But this is not today's topic, and so I'm not going to get into that. Still think it's very important. You've heard in the previous talks that people use a variety of methods. So if you have any questions or would like to discuss those, feel free to contact me after this. Okay, let's look at some data. So first of all, we're looking for a marker that is related to social interaction. Here in solid gray is data from healthy controlled subjects, and we see that we find a kind of brain synchrony in healthy subjects, which is compared to the so-called non-pairs. This is permutated data of individuals who were performing the same task, but they were not performing the task with each other. And if you look at brain coherence in those individuals, then this gives you sort of the baseline of how similar your brain activity is going to be, just because everyone is doing the same thing at the same time. And we see that we find neurocoupling that's significantly larger in healthy subjects compared to this permutated data. This is not the case for borderline personality disorder. So in these subject diets, we do not find a difference to this baseline permutated data, and they're significantly lower than the healthy control data. We do find similar effects in different tasks as well. This is data from the trust game paradigm, classical game economic task, where subjects just exchange money back and forth, and you have markers for relationship development and the development of trust and building your own reputation in the relationship with the other. And that's completely different in terms of modeling and the conditions and what you look at. But roughly, you can say you see the same thing. There's a form of synchronization and health that is not observable in our patient groups. Okay, so this shows us that neurocoupling is associated or is able to pick up disorder states, so it can differentiate between healthy individuals and current patients. And there's a couple of other questions that follow that. Namely, if it's able to pick up different states, can it also track changes in that state? Or are we looking at the neural or biological alteration that is stable across the lifespan? Or are we completely on the wrong track? And is what we're really looking at just a problem of dissimilarity? So maybe patients, especially patients with social interaction disorder, just interact quite differently, and so control subjects and patients just don't get along as much anymore. And at this point, I have to apologize to you. I usually like to discuss my current work and new data and presentations, and I decided to take out the unpublished data, which was directly targeting the dissimilarity question for borderline. It's getting ready to be published, and so I'm just going to have to ask you to wait until we have paper or preprint out. Okay, let's look at the data. Here you see the same thing. We have the in this sample data from current patients who show the neurosynchrony deficit. and the healthy controlled subjects who show between brain synchrony. And in terms of the disorder state changes, the pink bar is of interest. These are the remitted patients, and you see that there's no difference between remitted patients and full healthy control subjects. And this was spectacular because borderline is a personality disorder. And so by definition, it's stable across the lifespan. There's not really a concept of remission for personality or for personality disorder. And this was something that had been criticized by clinicians for a really long time. You still find it in DSM-5, unfortunately, to some extent. But our data and also other studies now from our clinical research group clearly show that there is remission. It takes a long time. It takes 10, 15 years, but there is remission. And that remission is, during remission, you can see normalization of all the neurobiological deficits that we usually describe for our current changes. So it's safe to say that neurocoupling can pick up disorder states and state changes. It does not seem to be a stable neural alteration as shown by the remitted data, but this is cross-sectional data. So the prime way of showing this is longitudinal data where we follow people and scan them a couple of years later when they're in remission and see if the neurocoupling recovers then. Okay, so if neurocoupling reflects the disorder states, and we know that the borderline acute state is characterized by very inflexible beliefs and neural responses, then the question is that if it does neurocoupling also map the dynamics that we know of, or the difference in dynamics between health and borderline. And the first thing to look at is learning. So you've seen in Pascal's work earlier, and also in other talks have also been published, that with experience and a task partner and health, you also increase neurocoupling. So once you get to know a person better, you achieve a higher plateau of neurocoupling with that person. And in the left figure, the gray bars show that we see this in our neurocoupling too. This is just plotted the first half to the second half of the task, and you see a significant increase in health, and that increase is not observable in our borderline sample. So there's no specific coupling, and that also doesn't increase over time. What we do see though is role effects. So our task, remember that we have the task has two different roles of in which direction that little snippet of information goes. So you can either be the sender of that information or you can be on the receiving end of that information. And while in the acute phases of the disorder, we don't see a role effect, in remission we do. So our subject pairs have a really high synchrony when the remitted patients perform as a receiver, so where they just have to respond to the interaction, than when they're initiating the interaction. This is always the same data, just plotted from a subject perspective to make it more clear. Okay, now we want to look at more clinical markers, and here borderline is a very special disorder because we really do not have any measure that predicts the development or the onset of the disorder, like we have for example, depression or schizophrenia. But borderline is almost exclusively observed following what is called childhood adversity. And childhood adversity is the quantification of the level of traumatizing events that individuals endured during their upbringing, and it is quantified over the level of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. And if you use this quantification and the model together, also with the group status, so these are remitted and current patients both together, so both factors are directly competing for variance, you see that the only good clinical marker we have for borderline is not related to the neurocoupling. So the higher your trauma load is, then the higher your deficit is. And this is nice result for two reasons. One is that if you think about childhood adversity and what is quantified, then this is always interpersonal trauma. So usually by the caretakers or someone close to the family. And also, childhood adversity is one of the best predictors we have for general mental health during the lifetime, and something that relates to more common neurobiological phenotypes that we described. And this is an example from processing of social affective stimuli in borderline, where, well, in health, you have something that is called habituation. So if you're repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus, then your response will be lower and lower over time. You get used to it, you habituate. Borderline patients do not habituate, so they show an increased response, and that sustains over time, and that is a very well described phenomenon, neurobiological phenomenon, also for health and disorders, and this relates to our childhood adversity as well. So we find the same effect for neurocoupling, which is our new hyperscanning complicated marker, and the pattern looks the same for these established markers. The data I showed you before was from joint attention, which is a nice task for simplicity, but it also means that we cannot derive any meaningful behavioral data from that. And initially we said we want neurocoupling or between brain coherence to be related to the interaction and the interaction outcome. So we have to move on to, in our case at least, to different tasks that provide such meaningful decision-making or cognitive, social cognitive performance. And here's an example work of Gabriela Stossel, who was working with the trust game paradigm for a long time. And the trust game is a task where subjects send back and forth money, basically trying to increase their win in the task. But by doing so, they have to trust the other person. And so you can derive very nice markers of building of the relationship, and you also build your reputation as a trustworthy partner, but you also learn to trust or distrust your partner. So there's a very rich behavioral data there that we can now relate to neurocoupling. And one example thing that we do is we look at the initial behavior, so how each diet starts out. So how trustworthy were you, or what kind of impression did you give on your first impression? And then we look at the final trust or the final relationship that the diet achieved. And in health, you see that there's no relationship between the two, which is because humans learn from experience. So when you first meet a person, after a few engagements with that person, a few interactions, you build your opinion about this person, and so your final relationship with the person depends on all the interactions that you had with them. And this is really different in borderline. We find a very high association between the initial impression and the final relationship. So there's not much learning, not much changing, which also relates again to dynamics that we talked about earlier. And of course, this results in the outcome of the interaction. So the interaction success is much lower, the task win is much lower, and so on. And this you can relate then to neurocoupling during these interactions, which is Gabriela's work, and we can say that these impairments in relationship building or trust building relate to the level of neurocoupling that the diet had. There's not very much work on clinical topics yet. One group you heard about this morning, or some of the work was mentioned this morning on autism, where roughly they find the same things as we do for borderline. So there's a deficit in between brain synchronization, which also relates to the symptom load that patients have. We looked in detail at our borderline disorder data. And I think it's really nice that Pascal just gave a talk just before me, because I love his work on mother or caretaker infant bonding and their interactions. And I do believe that it's going to move very closely to the clinical work that we do, because a lot of the factors that we describe as risk and resilience for mental health are factors or features you acquire in interaction with your parents. For example, emotion regulation, your skills and so on. This is learned in interaction with your parents, and other factors as well. It's really nice to see that there's this is one of the I think most successful applications of hyperscanning so far is the mother-infant studies that we do, and I think it is going to be picked up in the context of mental health very, very soon. Okay, to wrap up, let's look at the essential criteria that we wanted initially for hyperscanning derived biomarkers. We wanted it to relate to social interaction performance. I think we can be quite confident that this is the case. We wanted to differentiate between our groups. This is also the case with the neurocoupling deficit in current patients. We wanted to reflect, or it would be nice if we reflected also changes in symptom load or changes of social interaction difficulties. We can say, yes, we find this in a cross-sectional approach. If anybody has longitudinal data already, please raise a hand and enlighten us. And we wanted to be related to symptomatology, symptom load, or other relevant real-world measures. We did a lot of work on this. I only showed the clinical data today, but it's also safe to say that this is the case. Okay, with this, I close, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you.